National Television presents The Dissenters, conversations with editors and publishers of political opinion magazines. This week, Gilbert Harrison, editor-in-chief of The New Republic, a left-of-center periodical, interviewed by Donald Fauser.
Mr. Harrison, in a recent editorial in The New Republic, you refer to the absent consensus. And I wonder if you'd like to spell out that absent consensus to us.
Well, it's spelled out in the editorial you refer to, so of course the thing I'd prefer would be that everybody would buy the magazine and read it in full. But briefly, the idea was that at this particular point, what there had been of a consensus in favor of what Johnson calls the Great Society, which was never a very firm consensus and never, I think, a very radical consensus, but nevertheless a consensus that believed in things like Medicare, civil rights, doing something about the urban poor. That consensus has gone bust. I think probably the major reason for it's Vietnam. Because I agree with Walter Lippmann that you really can't have two crusades going on at the same time that the country's going to pay attention to and pay for. I don't think the people of this country right now have any interest. At least the white middle class doesn't have any interest, and they're the ones the Congress listens to, in backing up anything like a Great Society program. They're mad about the agitating Negroes. They're afraid they're going to take over their jobs or their houses or their neighborhoods. They're scared. They don't see why they ought to pay for a lot of freeloading people on welfare. And at the same time, they're pretty disenchanted with the war because the casualty figures are coming home, and so are the due bills for paying for it. So that whatever there was in the way of either a Johnson consensus on the war or a welfare consensus for the Great Society, I think has collapsed, and I don't know what's going to take its place. We're in a funny period of drift in this latter part of 1967. You got an election coming up. You don't know what's going to happen then. If you talk to congressmen here in Washington, I don't care whether they're in the House or the Senate. I mean, here the more sensitive and intelligent ones who take their job seriously. They're not just here to hold down a job. They just throw up their hands and say, well, you got to ride it out. And when I say to them, ride what out? They say, well, ride out this new kind of Doolittle coalition that's mischievous, that's essentially anti-things, that thinks that if you got to save money, take it out of the hides of the poor, and don't raise taxes, and don't do this and don't do that. I think those are the people that are in charge now. Now, how long they're going to be in charge and who follows them, I don't know. I suspect they reflect the mood of the country, and why that's so, I don't know, except for Vietnam, which has got everybody confused and unhappy, anxious.
I had a feeling right after President Johnson became president at the death of President Kennedy that there wasn't sort of a consensus that formed around him, and that consensus carried through the next election. Do you feel that in terms of domestic policy there never was a consensus?
Yes, I said there was a consensus of a sort, and I have the personal feeling that at the time of Kennedy's death, when Johnson took over, he could have done just about anything. I think the country was grief-stricken, shocked, looking to Johnson. Johnson, with his populist roots, with his feeling for the poor. He grew up as a fairly poor boy, his schoolteacher background, his old early association with the whole feeling of the New Deal and its concern for the people who had the least. All of that made of him a possible popular leader for a rehabilitated country where we began to turn our attention at last to the kind of festering problems that have been tearing this country apart and that are getting worse. And these are primarily the problems of the big cities. He could have done that. Well, instead of which he got involved in Vietnam, and I think most of the rest of the stuff has had to go down the drain because of that. There was a kind of a consensus, though, at that point. And you had things like Medicare, and you had the first real federal aid to, say, elementary education, higher education, and these were fine. But look what happened last year. You had in 65 and 66 some civil rights bills passed by the Congress. In the Senate, you even got cloture votes. You got 2/3 and more of the Senate to pass these civil rights bills. Then last year, you get a different kind of a civil rights bill. And for the first time, you're talking about no discrimination in housing. And Mr. Dirksen, who had been part of the consensus in the 2 preceding years that enabled us to pass the civil rights bill, got up and said, I won't have any of this. He began to hear from the folks back home, and the good white middle class said, don't you start pushing it this far. That's my house, that's my apartment house. That's the fellow across the street, that's property values. That's going too far. And the census began to crack up. It cracked up on civil rights. The riots have made the crack up go even further. And as far as I can see now, there is very little left to what used to be called the Johnson Consensus for the Great Society. And I think the President knows that himself. Here he is just the other day making a speech in which he is more violent about these so-called agitators, Negro agitators, calling them wretched, vulgar men, than any extremist in the Republican Party. Because he too senses that that's the mood of the country. So he's going to play it that way.
Well, if this is the mood of the country, then what you feel is that there should be really more emphasis put on solving the problems of the cities. Medicare, the model cities programs aren't enough. Rent subsidies aren't enough.
Of course they aren't enough.
Well, how much more do you envision we need there?
Well, I think you need at least the amount of attention and concern and thought and money given to the kind of life we're living here and the things that can be done about it as we're giving to Vietnam. And in money terms, that represents an investment of over $24 billion a year. You're going to have haggling in this session of the Congress over a $2.5 or less billion for the whole war on poverty. Think of the comparison. That's about 1 month of Vietnam. So I just mean that insofar as money is an index of concern, the country is not putting its mind to the problems that it has itself and that aren't going to solve themselves by just sitting around thinking that you can blame a few Negro agitators.
Well, is it your feeling that Congress would, hypothetically, if there were no Vietnam War, would Congress be willing to spend its money domestically?
This Congress?
Yes.
I doubt it. But you know, you can't separate these questions of what would be done from the problems of who the political leaders are. We respond to people who call on us to respond. You do that, I do that. Where do these programs come from? What makes people concerned? Who is it that gets up and says, look, these are the problems, I'm going to explain them to you. These are worrying problems. This is something America shouldn't tolerate. And here's why we shouldn't tolerate them. And here's what we can do about them. That's leadership. At the moment, for one reason or another, we don't have that kind of leadership. I don't mean that there aren't people in Congress. I think Bobby Kennedy's one. I think there are a lot of them. Not a lot, but there are enough who are concerned about the whole decay of our society, about the way people are living, about the number of unemployed, about the fact there's so many people who are poor in this country, and we're a rich country. And they're trying to do things. They hold hearings, they make speeches, they go out on trips and they look at things. But they're not in control. They're a minority.
Well, where is leadership in Congress leading?
Where is it? I don't think there's much. The leadership is in the White House. But then it usually is. You can't very well expect the Democratic Party in the Congress, even if it were united, which it's not, to come forward and take the leadership and define what the Democratic Party's purposes are. The leadership comes from the White House. It has for a long time. The President lays down the program. The President gives us a sense of where we ought to be going and what we ought to be paying most attention to. Nobody can do that but the President, and the Congress knows it. May not like it, but it's true.
Is it your sense then that the President, being so preoccupied with the Vietnam conflict, is really not able to lead this country domestically? Or is he simply reacting now to what he feels is hostility to domestic programs?
No, I think once the President allowed himself to be sucked into this Vietnam mess, that he gave up for all practical purposes the possibility of being a great leader of a great society. He gave it up, and I don't see how he can go back now. I don't see how he can retrace his steps. I think he's lost, and I'm sorry about that because I had hoped when he first came in that it would be otherwise.
Well, tell me about the war in Vietnam. Do you feel or not feel that an American presence in Asia is necessary, in South Asia is necessary? If so, is it simply that our role in Vietnam is not that kind of presence?
Well, presence is one of those new modern words.
I use them occasionally.
And I don't know what it means except that it means you're physically present. And of course, Americans are going to be physically present most everywhere in the world, where they're allowed to be. And the question is how you're present. There's a very great difference between the sort of John Kennedy statement of September '63, where he said, in effect, we can help the people of Vietnam, we can send them some advisors, we can give them some guns maybe, certainly some economic aid, perhaps some advice. But the future of Vietnam is their concern, and they're going to have to decide that. We can't. There's a great difference between that presence and the commitment of 500,000 men to a war in Asia, a land war in Asia. And it's the latter course that Mr. Johnson has allowed us either to drift into or has chosen. I regard that as madness, with no possible outcome but harm to Vietnam, to the United States, to the national interest of this country, in terms of its capacity to do things for itself, in terms of its relations with other nations of the world. Look around the world and tell me, where is the consent for this policy anywhere in the world? There's less and less of it in this country. It is a policy of madness. And it's very hard, if you're in my job week by week, to pick out the point at which it got out of control. Because when you talked to people 2 years ago and said, look, this is the way it's going, we ought to stop it, they said, well, it isn't going that far. And because, you see, we aren't going to do that. And then in a month later, they do that. And then, well, but we aren't going to go any further than that. And then they do that. If a year ago I had talked to people around this town and said, look, you know, the next thing you're going to do is bomb Haiphong, they would have said, now, come on, no, we have no intention of doing that. Well, that's what I mean by being sucked in. I don't know where it's going from here, but I don't see any sign that this administration has any real determination to get out of this thing.
There's been a lot of talk that right after the elections were held that there would be covert moves, diplomatic moves to try and find some way of reducing bombing in the North for a quid pro quo in the South. Have you any sense of anything like this going on?
You mean the elections in Vietnam?
Yes.
I've been listening to so much talk since I've lived in Washington for the last 3 or 4 or 5 years on Vietnam that I don't know what to say to a question like that. I've heard the same sort of talk. Yes, they would like this, they would like that. But what does it all boil down to? I mean, if the United States wanted to see peace in Vietnam, you don't have to sit around saying maybe they'll negotiate. There is no power in Saigon, there is no authority, there is no policy in Vietnam apart from U.S. policy. How many days, how many hours, how many minutes do you think the so-called representative government in Saigon could last if the United States said you're on your own? How many? So it isn't a question of what they will do or speculation. It's a question of what we decide we want to do. And what I would like to see us do, going again back to the Kennedy policy, is it's your war. It's your affair. We cannot do this thing for you. And we're not even sure that a victory of this sort or that is in the long run best for us or the Vietnamese. That's a matter for history to work out.
What about the influence that the United States has in other areas of South Asia, like Thailand? One argument has been always that if there were a confrontation made in South Vietnam or in Vietnam, it would preserve other countries, the domino theory.
Preserve them for what?
Lord knows, for democracy, for whatever,
well, of course,
so that we would maintain an influence.
Well, you know, that's pretty silly. I mean, I don't get this business of going around all over the world preserving something. What, for whom, in whose interest, and by what right do you do it? Thailand's been a military dictatorship for years. It now lives under martial law. We've got 7 or 8 big bases in Thailand. We've been using Thailand as a privileged sanctuary to bomb North Vietnam for a long time and not admitting it. Finally, we did admit it last year. We've got 40,000 troops in Thailand. The latest government figures of Thailand are that there are 1,500 communist guerrillas in the northeast. We save Thailand from them? And for whom?
What about Indonesia?
Indonesia saved itself.
Did it save itself? Do you
I
not
don't know,
think that
but at any rate, it changed governments without our help. The one place we've seen in Asia so far where a concerted and powerful bid by a powerful and large communist party failed was a country in which there were no American troops, Indonesia. And we've been now for years fighting in Vietnam. And with what result? Tell me.
What alternatives do you see on the domestic scene for the kind of leadership that we presently have? Do you foresee President Johnson being in trouble in the next election? Do you see him being nominated?
Well, I suppose he'll be nominated. I don't think there's any precedent for an incumbent president who wants to be renominated by his party not being renominated. I would like it to be otherwise. I'm sorry that he will be. Nothing would be more exciting and promising to me in politics than the prospect of a real revolt in the Democratic rank and file, and to see the people who don't approve of his policy taking charge of their party and dumping him.
You seem to
But
feel...
I don't think that's going to happen, because I suppose that when you're in office and you are the president and you do have a national party and a national committee, I suppose you're pretty much in charge of the machinery, and that you and I have no alternative but to vote for the people who are put up to us, that we can't really have much influence in terms of who's going to be the candidate, particularly when you're in, when the president is when the leader of the party is the incumbent president. I'm afraid that's the way it's going to be, but I'm sorry it is. I had wished that Bobby Kennedy would take a different attitude. I had wished that he had said, my conscience won't let me support this man. I can't go along in Vietnam, and I won't, which is what General Gavin has said. And if Bobby Kennedy had said that, he'd be the rallying point for an awful lot of people throughout the country who are fed up. But that isn't what he's chosen to say, not so far.
What about all the New Republic has observed that a great many members of Congress find themselves going back to the hustings and trying to decide how much ahead of the national ticket they can run in order to get reelected. If that is true, why don't we see some kind of a revolt in Congress if they really feel threatened by this policy?
Well, what do you mean revolt in Congress? I mean, you are seeing a revolt and will see a revolt in the sense of just the sense you mentioned, that there'll be more and more men running for office, both in the House and in the Senate, who are going to run on their own and in fact feel that the only way that they can win is to disassociate themselves from Lyndon Johnson. And they're doing it, and they will do it. But their first objective is personal survival. They're in no position to throw him out. They aren't the people who are going to dictate the party choice anyway. And all the tradition is against them, and all the weight of patronage and influence and everything else is against them doing that. So they're out to survive, to save their own skins, and I don't blame them, and I hope most of them do.
What kind of leadership do you find the Republican Party coming up with? What does the New Republic think about the Percys, the Reagans, the Rockefellers? Is there any alternative there, either for domestic policy or international?
Well, it's funny about the Republicans. I sometimes think to myself, well, at least a change of party, no matter who's the presidential candidate, would give the new party a chance to get out of Vietnam, cut those losses, and get on with other business. And I've thought that because it's the only thing that makes sense for a party. It doesn't come in with the accumulated obligations of the Democratic Party. It can make a break. I've hoped that's what it would do, and perhaps it would do that. I'm not sure how I'm going to feel next November, whether I'm going to vote for a Republican or a Democrat. I don't know. But if I look around at the kind of people the Republican Party talks about for the presidency, it's pretty discouraging. Because Nelson Rockefeller, as far as I'm concerned, is no great Socrates, and he certainly hasn't said anything that made sense to me on the war. In fact, he's been almost totally silent on Vietnam, and if you go back to that and look at his comments on world affairs in general 4 or 5 years ago, they aren't anything that would inspire great confidence in me, and yet I have to say that he probably is the man that I would be most enthusiastic for as the Republican nominee, because I have a feeling he's from New York, he's not too dumb, he's got a lot of bright people around him, his domestic record is good by comparison, and if you don't have Rockefeller, who are you going to have? Mr. Reagan, who has decided that the wind is blowing in the direction of the Hawks, and who comes out the other day and talks about the necessity to throw all of our technological power into Vietnam, and if that doesn't mean nuclear weapons, what does it? So he scares me. He's just sort of a warmed over Goldwater with real charm, and that doesn't excite me very much, except to fear. So there you are, and a lot of these other people that I think might be possible, like the Hatfields and the Percys, are barely known in the country. So, in brief, I don't look forward to 1968 and the elections with any great enthusiasm, because it doesn't seem to me that politically there is much of an option at the moment. But things can change, the Republicans can do something unexpected, Mr. Johnson could even get out of the war, I don't know. But at the moment it doesn't seem very likely to me.
Well, I'm curious about where the momentum for all of this comes. It seems that the country is not progressing domestically, despite a very high standard of living. If it appears like we're mired in a war in Vietnam that we don't want to be in, why isn't there enough pressure from down below to cause some change in all of these policies?
It's coming. It's coming. Just look at the popularity polls. There's been a real shift in this country, and there's going to be more of a one on Vietnam. People who thought we ought to go ahead and win this war 6 months ago now a little doubtful about it. They're not quite sure why we're there. Don't like what's happening. Don't understand where we're going. Don't understand why we can't either win or do something. Now, these things are happening, and they will happen even faster, I think, the next 6 months. You remember that right after the Glassboro meeting with the Russians, the president's popularity shot way up. And I remember a very wise commentator here in Washington saying to me that week when all the newspapers were running the stories about Johnson's new popularity, he said, it'll last about 2 weeks. It's just about what it did. It's right down again.
I would like to ask you what your feeling is in terms of the way our monies should be spent, the kind of money that you think it would be essential to pour into cities, into school systems, into rebuilding slums, to make the cities the kind of place that people would choose to live in. The New Republic has done a lot of articles, it seems to me, in this area about the need for expenditures in cities. And I wonder if you can, off the top of your head, give us some idea about that.
No, I don't know how much money it would cost, but I mean, it depends on what you want to do. You can spend as much as you want, depending on how far you want to go. All I say is that you ought to say, this is first priority. Now let's see how to do it. There are a lot of ways of doing this. I mean, I'm not suggesting that the whole problem is somebody deciding that we spend a lot of money, because a lot of money isn't necessarily the thing you need, but whatever is needed requires a lot of money, if you see what I mean. I don't think money is the answer to all problems, but I don't see how you answer most problems without a lot of money. And it would be academic to sit around and say, now, come on, let's work out a budget. That's what it'll take. Well, what's it going to take to make a city a place, as you say, that's tolerable, that you want to live in, that isn't messy and dirty and smelly and congested, and broken down homes, where you can't get to work or get back home without a nervous breakdown? Well, I mean, what is it going to take to do all that to our cities? And most of our people now are living in larger and larger communities. Nobody can answer that question. All you got to do is begin. Say, that's our first priority. We get to work on it. And we spend as needed, and we spend in ways as needed. Private enterprise can help in this. Business can help in this. Certainly the people who live in these towns can help in this, deciding what kind of communities they want to live in, managing their own projects. There are a lot of ways. This country is not dead in terms of initiative, ideas, imagination. I don't despair about this country, but I'm sure you don't find out how to do things unless you start doing them. And that's going to take a lot of money, but don't ask me how much, I don't know. The one part about the New Republic, of course, that we haven't even talked about, well, I'm not sure it doesn't interest me more than all the rest of it, is the literary side of the magazine. Insofar as the New Republic had a really genuinely great reputation over the last 50, 55 years. Mm-hmm. A great part of that came out of its literary writing. Edmund Wilson was the literary editor of this magazine, Malcolm Colley. And if you go back and look through our pages, I think you will find over that period of time that I think it's true to say more than any magazine in America, you had here a quality of literary discussion, of book reviews, of writing about art and music, later movies, that taken all together was unsurpassed. Mm-hmm. And that side of the magazine, which is not the political side strictly, or public affairs, but books, ideas, art, culture, is something I take very great pride in and interest in and get myself involved in. In some ways is more exciting than the week-to-week political developments, because, you know, Vietnam can be boring. It's a terrible thing to say about a war in which 10,000 guys are being killed. It's a terrible thing to say because you can't afford to be bored. It's too dreadful. It's awful. But in terms of personal satisfaction, there's just so much you can say about Vietnam week after week after week. You've said it all.
Yes, that's true.
And 1,000 more casualties doesn't change your point of view or doesn't really add anything to the argument. On the other hand, in the literary section, books coming out, there's an endless amount of discussion and interest that can go on, and that does go on. And that side of the magazine is something that I try not to downgrade, and that really does interest me almost more than all the rest of it.
Well, if you read just a list of contributors in the past, it reads like a who's who. John Dewey and Bernard Shaw and...
Don't mention it, because the weight of the past is awful. When I go back and look at the old copies of the New Republic, it's oppressive, because the names are, by virtue of their having survived, a drag on you. And you wonder whether anything you can do now, any young writer that you've never heard of, that you print now, will ever in 30 years be thought of the same way. Because you've got to live in the present with people that you don't know, hoping that you can say something lively and vital, exciting for your own moment that makes sense to you. And that's what's interesting. And when you go back and read Bernard Shaw and Keynes and Edmund Wilson and all the names that are such prestigious names today, you've got to remember that the time at which they appeared in the New Republic, they were just like John Doe, whose article I'm running next week, or not much more than that. They didn't have this prestigious quality, and you had to take your chance with them then, just as we're taking our chance every week with people that you never heard of or barely heard of, but you hope something's happening with them.
Well, if your sense is as good as the sense of the editors of the past, you draw those of us, along. We read Cole's because somehow we have a feeling that there is a judgment about Cole's work, in addition to reading Cole's work itself, that means something.
That's right. But
This is NET, the National Educational Television Network.
us about Christian Crusade.
National Educational Television presents The Dissenters, conversations with the editors and publishers of political opinion magazines. This week, Dr. Billy James Hargis, the publisher of Christian Crusade, a conservative magazine of Protestant theology and politics. Interviewed by Donald Falzer.
Again, as I said, the conservative position is that God exists, that we answer only to God, and that the government shouldn't get it between us and God. That if we have any needs, we can pray to God, and if there's any benevolent needs in the community, as Christians, we should meet those needs. We shouldn't depend upon a welfare state for security from the cradle to the grave. We should depend upon God, and we should depend upon our own humanitarian acts as Christians. This is the Christian philosophy, and it's also conservatism. Do you see what I mean now?
Well, I see that that is conservatism, I guess. What I don't see is why you couldn't believe in God and why you couldn't still believe in the combined intelligence of a group of people, like a nation, voting for certain laws which would guarantee that some people wouldn't die in poverty, live without a doctor, who, if they worked all their lives, wouldn't have some retirement fund that everyone had voted for.
Let me say this to you, that it is my feeling that the gospel of Jesus Christ changes a man to the place that he is his brother's keeper. And that is the responsibility of the church, for instance, the humanitarian needs of the community, the aged. The Bible says that pure religion undefiled before God is this, to visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction, to keep thyself unspotted from the world. This is the church's responsibility. We pay our tithes into churches. These tithes originally were not intended to put air conditioning units in churches and make the churches comfortable or build multi-million-dollar plants for 1 hour of education on Sunday morning. This money was to be used to help the less fortunate. The New Testament Christianity said that every man should work. The Apostle Paul was pretty bold and pretty brutal about this. He says if a man doesn't work, he shouldn't eat. Now, that's conservatism, in my opinion, to the nth degree. He says if a man is capable to work, he should work or he shouldn't eat. Now, this was the teachings of the Apostle Paul, and he emphasized the thing again. He said, as I said before, I say it again. If a man doesn't work, he shouldn't eat. In other words, a man is not the responsibility of the church nor society. If there's work to be done, he's physically able to work, and he refuses to work. We feel that the welfare state puts a premium on laziness, on slothfulness, and often even on lawlessness. As long as you reward people for bearing illegitimate children, and there's no moral responsibility involved in these acts, we feel that there's no end to this thing, and ultimately it will bankrupt the government. We feel that the Christians who have been saved by the gospel of Christ, and all people who believe in God, it is their responsibility to take care of their fellow man. Look at the Jewish people. This is a prime example. I've never seen a hungry Jew. I've never seen a Jew begging. I've never seen a Jew without work. That religion takes care of their people. They don't ask the state for help. They take care of their own. And we believe that Christianity is nothing more than a continuation of this Jewish concept with the gospel of Christ relating to salvation being added to that concept. So if it's worked for the Jewish people for thousands of years, that they take care of their own, and none of their people ever have to beg, why can't it work for the Christian people? Why can't it work for so-called Christian United States, where the majority of the people claim to be Christian? We do not think it's the responsibility of the state to take care of our fellow men. We think it's the responsibility of the church. The church ought to be building the orphanages. The church ought to be providing for the aged. Furthermore, the Bible teaches that it's the responsibility of the children to take care of their parents. This is part of New Testament Christianity. That I have a responsibility to care for my parents, just as my children have a responsibility to care for me when I become aged. That's New Testament Christianity. But now we have abdicated that responsibility. We let the state take care of our parents. And this isn't right. This isn't New Testament Christianity.
Well, I guess the feeling is that in a society which has become less traditional than in the United States society has become less traditional, that the complexities of city life, of urban life, thrust upon the state burdens, which indeed the private churches aren't assuming.
I agree with you. I agree with you that the responsibility for the mess that we're in today, this welfare state which is bankrupting our country, we have a debt that seemingly will never pay off, that the greatest responsibility for this is on the church that refused to accept its responsibility. I agree with that. The church has refused to accept its responsibility, just as individual Christians have refused to accept their responsibility, as I suggested a moment ago, such as caring for their parents and caring for their less fortunate brethren. But I still insist that the perfect society is the one that Jesus Christ laid down, where a man depends upon God, and as long as he's capable, he works and provides for his family. The Scripture says, if you don't provide for your family, you're worse than an infidel. That's what the Bible says. The Scripture doesn't say that we should let a neighbor care for our family as long as we're physically able to care for our family. The man who doesn't care for his own is worse than an infidel, and according to the Bible, according to the teachings of Jesus Christ. The ideal situation is the one that I think we once had in the early days of our republic, when people worked and they enjoyed working, and they enjoyed the fruits of their labor. And our whole society was built upon this free enterprise, this private competition, the accomplishments thereof. This was Christianity. I think the early days of America, mankind came the closest to practicing New Testament Christianity of any people in the history of the world. And we've gotten away from that. Now there is no individual responsibility. And I think it's partly because the church lost its way. The church misappropriated the funds, if you want to say. Instead of using the tithes and the offerings to fulfill its humanitarian obligations, they wanted fancier churches and fancier educational plants and so forth, and the money was misappropriated in a sense and used for purposes that were not intended in the Scripture.
How does this, however, solve the present problems that we have in this country, like bad schools and undereducated children, segregation in the South so that the Negro doesn't really have equal opportunity, the urban slums? How does this philosophy solve those problems?
When you give man pride in being an American and pride in being a human being, he's going to better his condition. But the welfare state tells these people, don't worry about yourself, we're going to take care of you. You're poor because society made you that way. I don't agree to that. I don't believe that the poor in New York City are poor because they have to be. I think they're poor because they want to be, or they lack the initiative to rise above the poverty class. Christianity says rise above your condition. Christianity says don't accept the status quo. Christianity says improve your life. Christianity says work. Christianity speaks of initiative. Christianity speaks of zeal. Christianity speaks of hard work. But men are trying to substitute for work pleasure and leisure, and it can't be done. The welfare state will continue to encourage people not to stand on their own 2 feet, because they're giving them security from the cradle to the grave. They're encouraging the people not to work, not to learn a trade, not to provide for themselves. They're encouraging the minorities especially to just constantly complain about their lot rather than trying to improve it. I read the other day where a group of minority group in a community that claims to be poor, that they had appealed to the United Nations for foreign aid for an American city. How ridiculous can you get? Now you speak of the situation in the South. Let's recall it wasn't Atlanta that was burned down, it was Detroit. Let's recall that your great race revolutions in this country have not been in the South. Your great race revolutions have been in the East and in the North. So let's not get to this place that we just automatically condemn the South whenever we think of segregation or racial injustices, because apparently they felt there were some causes up here. Now, I think this. For illustration, let's take the race riots. I'm on that subject, like Detroit and Newark and these other places. I doubt very sincerely that those things were the results of people being mistreated. I think it was results of people being treated maybe too well by the state. They were told they didn't have to work. They were told they didn't have to provide for their own. They were told that they could get security from the cradle to the grave. And these people wanted more and more and more. We're covetous by nature. We want more and more and more. We see someone with something that we don't have, we covet it. We want it. The Bible warns against covetousness. Christ told us never to covet somebody else's. They worked for it. They had it. They were entitled to it. They had a right to it. And I would say this: instead of encouraging people to want more and more, and encouraging them to demand more and more without paying the price of citizenship, we should teach the thing that should be done in Detroit and Watts and all these other places where there have been race riots, is set up vocational schools and teach them trades. Teach them how to be plumbers. You know what a plumber gets? Fantastic.
Yeah, well, the argument
plumber
is
gets more than a PhD. They ought to put up vocational schools and teach them to be plumbers and electricians and cameramen and interviewers and preachers and everything else. I mean, these people need to be taught to use their hands. But they'll never accept this responsibility until you give them a challenge of initiative. the challenge of the American system, that you don't have to be poor. You don't have to live in slums. You can improve your lot if you want to have a will to win. If they don't like Detroit, they can move south. If they don't like the South, they can move to Detroit.
The argument is, you see, they don't even have the educational opportunities, and they are ghettoized.
Oh,
they don't
cut
like
it out,
being
cut it out. The head of 3M, which is one of the largest industries in the United States, I understand doesn't have a college education. I have a year and a half in college. Maybe it shows in what I'm doing. But I was only able to get 1 year and a half in college. And yet I have a movement here that has hundreds of thousands of followers. And I had an idea, I had a vision. I believe that God had chosen me to try to awaken the American people concerning the threat of communism internally. And I didn't let the fact that I didn't have a formal education stop me. I went out and did the best I could. My tools were limited. My abilities were few, but I did the best that I could. My father never owned a home. We rented a house. My father was a truck driver and a farmer. And I remember when I graduated from high school, I complained because I alone in that class, it was during the Depression, I alone didn't get a graduation ring. And I criticized. There was a kid that I knew real well whose father was quite wealthy. He was in insurance business. And I said, why can't I have the money that so-and-so has? Why don't you have the money? Why doesn't the government make his dad give me a graduation ring? My dad grabbed me by the shoulders with his ham-like hands, and he said, boy, this country doesn't owe you anything but an opportunity. And that's been my philosophy in life. God doesn't owe me anything but an opportunity, and the counsel and the guidance to make the best of it. And this country doesn't owe me anything but an opportunity. This country doesn't owe anybody anything but an opportunity to get an education if they want it, an opportunity to get a job if they want it, an opportunity to start a business if they want it. But it depends upon initiative and zeal and drive. It depends upon the individual. You've got to instill in every American, minorities and majorities, a desire to get ahead, a desire to use the American system to the fullest extent.
Well, how do you do that? Because you're offering me
That's what I'm doing
a
right
frontier
now.
solution.
That's what I'm doing right now. That's exactly what I'm doing right now. I'm telling the Negro people to quit whining. I'm telling the poor white people to quit whining. Quit whining about injustices, real or imagined. But get out and better your situation. Stand up on your own 2 feet. Don't wait until somebody comes along and gives you life on a silver platter. Christ teaches us to stand up and live and do our best in life and to reach for the clouds. We need inspiration in America today. Instead of this guilt complex, we have written off the South. We refer to the South as segregationist South. We've just written them off. Massive guilt complex. Now we're writing off Detroit. We're writing off all these places that have racial disturbances. We don't need this negative spirit that's in America. The welfare state, the socialists, the liberals have given the United States, majorities and minorities, a guilt complex, that we're guilty of something, that we haven't shared, that we've got too much, or that we've done wrong, or we're prejudiced, or we are the discriminators, or we're this or that. I'm tired of this guilt complex.
You don't think it's true?
This is the greatest country in the world, and we have the freest nation in the world, and we've got we have a system of government that'll let any man go as far in life as he wants to go, with or without education, if he but desires to. But it depends upon the individual. Does he have the zeal and the initiative and the challenge and the inspiration under God, or is he dependent upon the Johnson administration and the welfare state for security? Personally, I'm dependent upon God to make my dreams come true. You can depend upon the welfare state if you like to make your dreams come true, but I don't trust the welfare state. So I'm trusting God. I have complete confidence in Him, and I think we've got a future.
Well, now, what about what you find in the United States as the internal subversion of the country? Do you feel that communism in this country really does have a hold on a major portion of the population and is influential? Is it influential in government policies?
As far as you're saying, are the American people, or majority of the American people, communists? This would be ridiculous. The majority of the people of the Soviet Union are not communists. They claim that less than 15% of the people of Russia are communists. I don't think the communists ever took over a country by free elections, did they? I don't recall a single country they ever took over a free election. It was by revolution or military coup or infiltration. Certainly they don't have a numerical majority in the United States. This would be ridiculous. But I will tell you this, they have influence. They had influence in these race riots. These men, like Stokely Carmichael, who are going to Fidel Castro's Cuba, and who are going to Hanoi, to Ho Chi Minh's Hanoi, and allying themselves with international communism. You can call them, if you like, sophisticated intellectuals, but I call them communists. As far as I'm concerned, the Black Power movement is a Red Power movement. you do have the communist influence in this country. You find this same motley crew of communists showing up wherever there's a racial revolution, wherever there's a race riot. Something ought to be done to, quite frankly, and I realize that this, our liberal friends are horrified at this statement, but since the communists are killing our kids in Vietnam, I think we're perfectly justified in outlawing the Communist Party and its activities in the United States. We certainly outlawed Nazism in World War II, and we certainly should outlaw communism in World War III. You know, these communists that are killing our men in Vietnam are communists just like the ones in New York or the ones in Chicago who are dedicated to the same international cause and these same international objectives.
Well, but all of the evidence about the Communist Party in the United States that I've read is that the Communist Party is in shambles, that it's an old and aging membership, and every time a member dies, the daily worker loses a subscription.
Well, this is whether or not
you
would say that the Communist Party and the New Left are the same. Now, you wouldn't say the New Left is in shambles. They had quite a pretentious convention in Chicago just recently. They followed the Communist Party line from A to Z. They opposed victory over communism in Vietnam or anywhere else. They urged our pulling out of all of these countries that we're now have military involvements in to protect these countries from going communist. I think the communists will take advantage of any problem in the United States. I didn't say that Detroit was started by the communists, the riots. I didn't say the riots in Cleveland started by the communists, but the communists were there. The government committees have said they were there. They've named them they were there. They were involved. They were certainly throwing, they were trying to fan the fire. This is my point. They'll exploit any problem in the United States for the intent of causing a revolution of any kind in the United States for the overthrow of the government, ultimately for communism. Now, communism is in the business of exploiting problems. They're in the business of trying to cause dissent. I don't believe the country's in the mess that you think it's in. I think the majority of the Negroes are pretty well happy with America. The majority of the Negroes in this country are Christian. They're fundamentalists, too. There's very little theological liberalism among Negroes in this country. Most of them are theologically conservative. They love Christ. They believe in the Bible. The majority of the American Negroes are fiercely loyal. They're fiercely patriotic, and they're fiercely religious. And I don't think you find the discontent that you seem to feel there is among the Negroes, among the rank and file of the Negroes in this country. I think they're quite happy with America, and I think they're willing. For instance, they tell me there are more Negro millionaires in Atlanta, Georgia than any single city in the United States. Is this true? They say there are 27 Negro millionaires in Atlanta, Georgia. So you can get ahead in the South. Some of them are getting ahead. Negro conditions can be improved in the South, but they can also be improved in Boston. And white conditions can be improved in Boston. But they'll be improved when you instill in your fellow man a desire to get ahead. When you instill in him the responsibility of citizenship. And when you inspire him and challenge him to move out beyond his environment. Lincoln moved out beyond his environment, and we can produce Lincolns today, you know.
One of the things I am curious about is you seem to feel that there is support amongst the Negro community and indeed in the country at large for the war in Vietnam. The polls show a gradual disenchantment with the war in Vietnam.
No. I would question that. This is a statement of generalities you've just said, my brother, and you're a better man than that. The polls do not show that at all. The polls show a concern over the way the war in Vietnam is being conducted. Listen, there's tremendous resentment against the Johnson handling of the war in Vietnam among conservatives. Senator Goldwater, no less a figure than Senator Goldwater, said that we ought to win that war in Vietnam and bring those boys home to their wives and children. Said we ought to bomb the supply lines, such as Haiphong Harbor. I think that the majority of the feeling of the United States is against the handling of the war in Vietnam, not our being there, but the handling of the war in Vietnam. There's a clamor throughout this nation that we win the war in Vietnam and get this thing over with and come home.
Well, what does
if we can't
mean?
whip the Vietnam, well, let me ask you this. Would you have had to ask that question in World War II in relationship to the Nazis? If I had said we ought to win the war against the Nazis, would you have had to ask me, what do you mean by winning? Why do the liberals, I'm not going to say you're a liberal because you're a good interviewer, why do the liberals in this country, why did they demand a victory over Nazism in World War II, and they're willing to compromise and appease with equal satanic and vitriolic enemies, the communists in World War III. Why did you demand total victory in World War II and you'll be satisfied with anything in World War III? Why? Have we changed our minds about the virtue of victory? Have we changed our minds about our faith in the superiority of the American system? Have we lost our American dream and our determination to be independent and free? I can't imagine a liberal that would have allowed a Nazi organization to exist in the United States in World War II. But they're perfectly willing to let communists like Gus Hall go on college campuses in World War III. This, to me, is incompatible. There's something wrong with that.
In terms of Vietnam, most people feel, the argument is that there is a national movement afoot there as well as a communist movement afoot there, and that there's a question about whether the United States should commit $28 million a year and 500,000 troops to that battle when it seems to people that there's a great deal to be done here at home with that same money,
including
not taxing conservatives as much.
Well, now you're trying to get me on your side by saying something friendly, and I'm not going to fall for that. But let me say this to you. You demanded, all the liberals demanded, all conservatives, every American demanded total victory in World War II. We wanted to stamp out Nazism in the world. Communism has enslaved more people than Hitler ever did. Communism has killed more people than Hitler ever did. And yet we're willing to live and let live with the communists. We are in a war. And somebody's going to win in Vietnam. We'll either win or the communists will win. And I cannot understand this attitude that so many people have today that we'll settle with something short of victory in Vietnam. We should not get involved in any war we don't intend to win. We shouldn't go anywhere at any time and start a conflict that we don't intend to win. It's not the American way. There is no substitute for victory. This is fundamental Americanism.
Well, you see, the argument is that there are many communisms in the world today. That the communism in Yugoslavia is different from the Soviet Union, which is different from communist China.
And you believe that?
You don't believe that?
I most certainly do not. I most certainly do not. This would be, we would be questioning the intelligence of our viewers if we were to suggest to them that communism in Yugoslavia is different from communism in the Soviet Union, or that communism in Vietnam is different from communism in Hungary. Communism is communism. It is an international conspiracy against democracies, against republics, against freedom. Communism is our enemy. We will do more. We will do more to discourage the ambitions of the communists of the Soviet Union by winning the war in Vietnam than anything we can do. I read this week, and it was put out by some government source, that 83% of the war material that the Viet Cong is using comes from the Soviet Union. So apparently this is not a Mao Zedong war or Zhou Enlai war in Vietnam. This is 83% of the war material that's coming from the Soviet Union, so they're pretty much involved. All I know is this, that we are in a life and death struggle with international communism. The communists have been taking over country after country, including Cuba, 90 miles off the shores of the United States. And these nations in turn against us. They enslave their people. Along with the enslavement of people is the unnecessary martyrdom of Christians and other religious people. The enslavement of people includes the abolishment of private ownership property. They become mere robots of the state. We don't want that in this country. We believe that America is the greatest nation in the world. We believe that our system of government is the shining example to all the nations of the world. We don't believe at a time that we're fighting communism in Vietnam that there should be any communist influences at work in the United States. Turning moving our government left, whether it's the new left or the old Communist Party. And we believe that this nation needs a unity and patriotism, as we had in World War II. Every American wanted to win, but every American doesn't want to win now. And we're not united. These boys feel it in Vietnam. I was over in Vietnam. There is a bad morale over there, a shortage of morale. They read the newspapers that are sent to them about the draft card burners and about the anti-Vietnam peace marches, and they read about the Fulbrights and so forth attacking our position in Vietnam. This is a source of discouragement and frustration. These boys in Vietnam today, in a sense, are the most heroic soldiers we ever sent into a foreign battlefield, because for the first time in the history of America, we've sent soldiers away that do not have the wholehearted support of the American people. So they not only have to keep up their morale to either to win a war that they're not allowed to win, but to keep up their morale and with this foolish type of war, but at the same time, they've got to ask themselves every day, what's going on at home? And why am I over here if they're not behind me? I say that we ought to unite behind the men in Vietnam, finish the war, come home, and frankly, I think we need a new administration in Washington, D.C.
But how are you going to win the war in Vietnam if you can't do it with $28 million a year and 500,000 men? What is the answer?
The answer is to, wouldn't you suggest that the military be relieved from all of these guidelines? Now there are things they can bomb and can't bomb. For instance, they can't bomb the supply lines of the Haiphong Harbor. I'm no authority on Vietnam or military affairs. I'm talking as just one American citizen. If we can't whip the Viet Cong, what makes you think we'd ever whip the Soviet Union or Red China with 600 million people?
Well, the hope is that you won't have to, you see.
Oh, yes.
The hope is you don't have to.
And therefore, if we appease and pull out of Vietnam and let South Vietnam go to the communists, that this is going to ensure us that we'll never have to fight Russia and China. Is that what you're saying?
Well, what you are saying, it seems to me, may lead us to an Armageddon in which we will have to rely on a whole new planet to take over this.
No, we won't have an Armageddon until the second coming of Christ. You're getting into theology now.
That's not my dish of tea. I must say, I never seem to be able to convince people like you that I'm right. I don't know where our standoff is.
Well, you know, this is a wonderful thing about the American government. And this is why I feel that in the United States, that freedom of speech is so important. And this is what concerns me a great deal, because there are efforts being made these days to suppress freedom of speech for the conservative viewpoint. For illustration,
This is NET, the National Educational Television Network.
Did you find a need? Did you find a vacuum?
National Educational Television presents The Dissenters. Conversations with the editors and publishers of political opinion magazines. This week, William F. Buckley, Jr., editor of National Review, a conservative publication, and host of his own syndicated television program, Firing Line. Interviewed by Donald Fauser.
Circumstances not oriented journalistically at all.
Considered as the editor of National Review and on your program Firing Line, to be considered one of the major dissenters in the United States today. And I wonder if you'd spell out some of the areas in which you dissent most avidly with consensus society, with the United States domestic policies today, and/or foreign policies.
Well, beginning with the domestic point, it seemed to me reasonably clear that in the past 40 or 50 years, there was a bifurcation, and politically, people began to do what H.L. Mencken called substitute political for economic means of self-aggrandizement. That is to say, there was a sort of a dawning consciousness of the political instrumentality by which people could vote wealth to themselves, provided somebody got around to creating a surplus. And that this had the effect of undoing the sort of a generic liberalism, which was probably the most striking event of 400 or 500 years earlier, namely the dawning realization by individuals that they could govern themselves, that they could strike out for themselves, that they could make decisions that affected their own lives. And this seemed to me a centripetalization, social centripetalization, which would cut the whole energy circuit of civilizations and keep people from maintaining the kind of self-dependence that results in creativity and in freedom. And it's that trend, I think, that conservatism has been very much alert to.
You feel, then, that the profit motive is a more natural motivation for man to aspire than for him to try to do this collectively in a political way?
I wouldn't accept your formulation, because there's nothing wrong with the collectivity so long as you have a total acquiescence in it. If you and I decide jointly that we want to stroll down Park Avenue together, there's nothing wrong with considering ourselves as a collectivity engaged in that particular pursuit. But the trouble is the democratic practice at some point starts counting noses. And if you and I and Mr. Briggs here decide to do that, and we decide that the majority shall decide whether we stroll down Park Avenue or do something else, then instantly we are coercing somebody. And the problem of a democratic society in terms of the libertarian paradigm is the minority that doesn't want to go along. Now, I don't take myself any satisfaction out of coercing a minority to go along when it doesn't choose to go along, unless it's absolutely necessary for the safety of the community. But it seems to me that presumption, the presumption in right of the individual to do what he wants to do, is simply widely disregarded in our society. Labor unions, of course, being a classic example.
But one manifestation I see here is such thing as the graduated income tax, and what indeed you're doing there is to take away from a few and give to the many for the public good. Now, it would seem to me that if we were to follow your philosophy logically, we wouldn't have such a thing as graduated income tax.
Absolutely not. I think that the graduated income tax is an institutional form of continuing class warfare. In the first place, I think people don't understand, a lot of people don't understand, that the kind of money that's drained from the rich as a result of the steeply progressive tax is totally exiguous. It doesn't amount to anything at all. If you take all of the money raised between, let's say, the 50% level and the 91% level, which is where it stood a couple of years ago, it amounted to less than $1.5 billion, i.e. In the vicinity of 1.25% of the national budget. So it isn't as though you need that money. What you seem to need is to penalize people for making a lot of money. Now, it seems to me that one of the blessings of equality is that people ought to be equally free to make money and to keep the money they earn, subject to the exactions that are necessary to take in order to run society. Now, if one could say, well, society simply can't proceed without that money, then you might appeal to the authority of the previous criterion I gave, namely the safety of the state. But this, as I say, is completely missing. You find in the rhetoric of the left, not that the money is needed, but that they just don't want anybody like H.L. Hunt to have his, whatever the hell his income is, $100 million a year. Now, I think most things about Mr. Hunt are deplorable, but I just don't think it's any of my business to build laws whose function is to victimize somebody that I happen not to find totally admirable.
Well, but the question, I guess, is if you're to try and have any kind of equalitarianism in society, where are you going to get the money to build roads, to...
Here's another thing about it. Another thing that's not widely realized is that in any generally affluent society, for instance our own, it is almost always the poor man who's paying. That is to say, the burden of taxation falls most squarely on the shoulders of the lower middle class. The secretaries, the subway workers, the elevator people, they are carrying the lion's share of the load, and always will, because a society is never going to become so affluent that there will be enough Rockefellers and H.L. Hunts around to carry anything like the load of our government, which is now, as you know, in the vicinity of $150, $160 billion a year when you count in state revenue.
But
now, Professor Friedman has shown that with the exception of one or maybe two of our grandiose state welfare and federal welfare programs, they actually have the effect of subsidizing the middle class at the expense of the lower class. If you like, just one example, free education in New York. Now, it is absolutely predictable that anybody who goes to college in New York is going to have a higher salary, a higher income by the time he's 25, 30 years old than, for instance, the average taxi driver or the average elevator operator. And yet, we've got this free tuition imperative here. And the net effect is the ironic one, that poorer people are being made to take sacrifices for the advancement of richer people. Now, this is one of those ironies which, in a curious sort of a metaphysical sense, is almost built in to any redistributionist system. Russia, you know, where we're going to have real equality, where we're going to have the paradise of the working class. What do you have there? You have a second lieutenant makes 10 times as much money as a private, whereas in the United States it's the ratio of 3 to 1. You have banks paying 12% interest for people's savings. These, as I say, are ironies that tend to happen when a society overreaches what are its proper ambitions. Its proper ambitions are ready to get out of the way.
Well, that's only to say, really, that the Soviet Union has failed, and but it's not necessary that other countries fail in the same approach.
I don't know one that hasn't. People always say Sweden. Let's look at Sweden. That's the successful socialist haven. Well, the trouble with pointing to Sweden is that there are no, in a scientific sense, controls. How would Sweden have fared if they didn't have this heavy taxation, if they didn't have this government participation in so many enterprises? I think Sweden has proved that democratic socialism is possible under certain conditions, and this I grant. But I don't think that Sweden has proved at all that this is a means by which to attain the highest form of civilization, let alone the highest form of general affluence.
You have stated in the past that the federal government is most adept at collecting taxes, but not at dispersing them.
Oh, I was quoting Moynihan.
That's right.
My new mentor.
Do you, well, yes. That's a strange bedfellow. Do you agree with
You
this?
understand? He's sharing my bed, not I his.
You think he's moving?
Well, he's a very honest man. He's a rugged, as I said about him before, he's a PT 101 liberal. Actually wears it, and he considers himself a liberal, but he also believes that the whole function of liberalism is its claims to rationality and pragmatism, and the rationality, the pragmatism shows that many of the pretensions of modern liberalism simply don't work out. One of them being, for instance, the notion that the Great Society could actually reach into every ghetto in the country and sort of re-stimulate a self-generating ethos that was going to sort of drag everybody out of poverty. It doesn't work. And it was Moynihan also, no, I guess it was Goodwin, who said, we have to face it, we liberals, that the conservatives came by something intuitively that we liberals have needed to get by the force of intellection, namely the suspicion of big government. So I think it is true that everybody, from Bobby Kennedy to Goodwin, Moynihan, people all of a sudden discovering the last couple of years things that they thought Goldwater was a lunatic for affirming even as recently as 3 or 4 years ago.
This is you have mentioned in the National Review the use of corporations, especially insurance companies, in helping to rebuild slums. I wonder if you'd speak to that. What you see as cooperation or coordination between federal government and private industry here. Do you see that as a step in the right direction?
Well, only in the sense that the federal government has been the principal inhibiting source for the development of public housing, and that is to say, it has exercised a negative influence. How? In 2 ways. One, by granting monopoly privileges to labor unions. The cost of construction, for instance, in New York City has gone up 14% per year. Now, how in the hell do you expect poor people to build houses that they can afford to pay for if it increases by 14% plus what you need to do to borrow the money? There's 21% per year, mind you. Now, I'm all in favor of electricians making as much money as they can possibly make, but I'm not in favor of their making money by the force of oligopolistic extractions on the community. I think that other people, even if they're Negroes, ought to be allowed to be electricians, and plumbers and bricklayers, and yet in point of fact we know that New York City is a union town, as I assume Boston is, as most towns are, and are protected as such by, who do you know, our old friend, the federal government. We also know that the federal government's tax structure is so heavy as necessary to be accounted for by the building trades industry. It's all very well to say let's have higher and higher taxes, but inevitably, of course, those taxes are passed along to the consumer. And my point is that it's extraordinary how well, in fact, American enterprise has acted even under the strain of that particular overhead, but it has meant that people are paying an awful lot of money for housing that they needn't otherwise pay. There is, of course, a third factor, and Henry George, of course, I think had the most sublime intuition concerning it, and that is that land is the one non-expansible element in that particular equation leading to wealth, which is why I myself am in favor of extremely high taxation aimed at land speculation.
But the argument, I guess, is if the unions earn more money, and if they charge more money for buildings, that indeed the economy must be able to bear this cost, or somewhere it would stop.
Well, somewhere it has stopped. Ask the people who are, the 4 or 5 families who share single rooms in Harlem, whether it stopped. And the answer is, of course, it did, as far as they're concerned. They can't get, quotes, decent housing for the price that they are able to pay. And one of the reasons they can't is because it can't be produced. One of the reasons it can't be produced is because electricians can be making $20, $25 an hour. And one of the reasons they're making $20, $25 an hour is because you and I, if we wanted to become electricians, would find it very, very difficult to crack that union. It's paternalistic, it's self-protected, and it simply aborts the whole processes of supply and demand, which should make it attractive for people to become electricians and plumbers and bricklayers, considering that they are in short supply.
Let me ask you, if I can, a rather hypothetical question. That is, that if you had your druthers, what would you rather have done in this country? what kind of a form of federal government-state relationship would you see? How effective, how influential would the federal government be in the lives of people? And how much of this would be, of what is now a federal function, would be absorbed by states and or local communities?
You ask awfully cosmic questions.
Well, what I'm trying to get at, I guess, is in a rather general way, what you see wrong with the country today, and as a dissenter, indeed, in this country, how you would change it, how you would alter it.
Well, I have to answer, of course, theoretically, and theoretically, I think the best articulation of a sound principle of government was done by the popes in encyclicals dating back to Rerum Novarum, on a principle they call subsidiarity. And the principle of subsidiarity says the following, that nothing should be undertaken by government which can be done by a private association, and nothing should be undertaken by a higher echelon of government that can be undertaken by a lower echelon of government. So that applying that test to the federal government, you ask yourself, well, now, what is the reason why Washington, D.C. should be financing a study of juvenile delinquency in New York City? The answer is, of course, none at all. No reason at all, at least by that standard. However, you run into this difficulty, and that is that since the federal government has developed this wonderful gathering system, tax gathering system, and tends to preempt the taxable income, can the state of New York or the city of New York or other states of the Union afford themselves to put up the money to attack problems that are distinctly local? So you see a situation in which the federal government has got to exercise a self-inhibiting influence. I think it's rather a pity that Congress doesn't exert itself more and simply cut down the uses of money, or else lease their money-raising facilities to the states, in effect, the Heller Plan, or whatever you want to call it, in order to return money to the states with which they themselves can undertake these functions.
Well, one of the reasons that the federal government, it seems anyway, that one of the reasons the federal government assumed so much power was simply because there was a feeling that states were not, in fact, solving their problems.
Yeah. Well,
I'm not sure that they've done any better.
It's an interesting observation because, among other things, it completely challenges one's central faith in democracy. If an individual state isn't solving a problem, it may be because, A, that state doesn't consider it a problem worth solving, or at least worth solving at the price of heavy taxation or at the price of a particular kind of legislation, or it may be that the particular state feels that it is so impoverished on April the 16th of every year as to leave them without the resources to solve that particular problem. Now, one of the difficulties, of course, with interventionist government of the kind that we have in the federal government is that they're always discovering problems and they're always discovering rights. And of course, you can't discover a problem without discovering sort of a duty to solve it. And you can't discover a right without discovering somebody else's correlative obligation. And this, in part, tends to be to result from the kind of millenniarism that is identified with utopian liberalism. And it's also, in part, however, the grubby demands of politics. Arthur Schlesinger was wandering around the country in the late 50s, terror with a sort of a jaded concern over the fact that people weren't dissatisfied enough. And he pointed to all sorts of dissatisfactions which he wanted to transform from abstract dissatisfactions into felt dissatisfactions. And the whole notion was, of course, to spur the government on into trying to decide some new means by which to seduce the support of the voters, because this is, of course, a power situation. And they're always going to find something to do. What is the Democratic platform going to offer the people in, 1976? Free what? And yet don't we know almost instinctively that they're going to have to think of some free something to offer us on into the future?
Well, the question...
And this means discovering problems.
Well, that's true.
Your false teeth, for instance,
but the
is
problem
going to be discovered by government, by the Democratic Party in 1776.
That may be. The problem I see, you see, is that if the federal government is best at raising money, then it must also disperse that money somehow, even if it were to disperse it to the states. Then the question...
Why not raise it in the first place?
Why not raise it in the first place? Well, yeah. No, but that's an interesting point, you see, but the problem is that what you say is that the states don't see what needs to be done. I guess what I see happening in the United States is a gradual homogenizing of the country so that there is less difference between New England, Massachusetts, and Alabama in the South, and that somehow disbursements have to be made to try and equalize the opportunities in those various disparate parts of the country.
Why?
This is what I see as happening in the homogenized, because it seems to me that by and large, in the way they voted, people believe that this is the way...
No, they don't. They don't believe it at all. You know why they don't believe it? Because the overwhelming majority of the voters really believe that there is a spontaneously generating dollar in Washington, D.C. And this to me is so manifest as to be a political certitude. In New York City, simultaneously, the same constituency will instruct its local legislators to say no to more taxes for schools this year, and they'll instruct their federal legislators to pass a federal aid to education bill, which has the effect of taxing 3 times as many dollars from them, only 1/3 of which are remitted to them, as would be taxed if they went into it as a process of auto-taxation. Now, if you were to say to the people in New York, look, the net effect of this proposed legislation is to take money from you and simply give it to Alabama or Mississippi or Hawaii or whoever. And I think it's awfully philanthropic of you, and we really do appreciate it. Now let's proceed with the business. Do you think that they would be instructing their legislators to do that? The answer is no, they wouldn't. If they actually understood the economic mechanics of what it is they were doing, they would probably say no. Now, maybe they should say yes, and under circumstances they should say yes. But it's also true that our concern is for quality education. Who really says that New York can benefit Mississippi more by shipping money on down there or by raising the level of New York education? I think a very good case can be made for the latter rather than the former. See what I mean?
Yes, I do.
The idea of egalitarianism in education neglects the fact that the quality of education in New York is something that might ultimately redound to the benefit of Mississippi infinitely more than, as I say, simply a truckload of dollars going down there every month or so.
I think the only argument I could think would be that the disparity between educational levels in both of these places would lead to major dissatisfaction on the part of the people in Mississippi.
Good. That's what we want. Precisely the first step to progress is major dissatisfaction.
It seems to me that maybe then you'll get the kind of situation you find in the ghettos today.
No. If you get major dissatisfaction, you get things like reform. But you see, one of the troubles with Mississippi, for instance, is that so obsessive is the federal spending problem that allocations are made with reference to it. If you get Washington, D.C., and says to the legislature of Mississippi, look, we will put in $9 for every buck you put up for highway building. Whether there's an enormous temptation to have highways, great big superhighways running from nowhere to nowhere, because it's a way of getting 10 to 1 on your money, in effect. Well, but that means that they do have to put that $1 up. And they put so many of those $1 up to claim those $9 that they tend to neglect that which they would otherwise perhaps not neglect, such as education.
Can you tell me what the National Review's stand on the Vietnam War is, indeed, in the confrontation overseas with communism?
Well, we have supported the war, not enthusiastically, but for different reasons, as you would suppose, from the reasons that, say, liberals unenthusiastically support the Vietnam War. Our notion is that it is strategically unintelligible to get that excited about Vietnam unless Vietnam relates to a worldwide situation, and that it makes schizophrenics of us all, on the one hand, to proceed against Vietnam on that assumption, and on the other hand, to cozy up as we have been to the Soviet Union as though it represented no threat conceivable or potential at all. If Vietnam is something to worry about, it's something to worry about because it is part of a worldwide movement. If it isn't part of a worldwide movement, we have no more reason purifying the politics of South Vietnam than we do those of Papa Doc's Haiti. In fact, a good deal less, considering that Haiti is close to our own shores.
But you find that it is?
Yes, I think there's no question about it, that the invasion of South Vietnam is a part of the general exuberance of the communist movement, which has got to be checked. And I think Mr. Rusk a while ago made a very, very good point, that all those people who worry about Lyndon Johnson's credibility gap should do a little thinking about America's credibility gap. If, in fact, we make promises, and we shouldn't make any promises that don't relate to our own security, and then fail to redeem them, what kind of a credibility gap are we going to have as a potential ally?
Well, what about the threat of the Soviet Union? Do you see a threat of the Soviet Union and an East Europe
Hell,
still?
yes. Sure. I think you'd feel one rather keenly if you happen to be one of its slaves. You mean, do I as an American
But the
feel
slaves
that?
are less slaves. All I'm trying to get at is if there has not been a change.
They're less slaves, yeah. They're somewhere between, say, the Greek slaves and the Roman slaves in terms of the kind of freedom that they exercise. But, of course, I feel a threat. I feel a threat whenever anybody that I don't control has hydrogen bombs that can land over my roof. And it seems to me indisputable that the Soviet Union has such bombs, indisputable that they continue to maintain a military machine at an extraordinary cost in terms of their own level of living, and that they presumably do that because they are fired to do that by something. Well, what that something is, of course, is an aggressive imperialistic ideology, Weltanschauung, which incorporates in its future not only designs for the people of the Soviet Union, but designs on you and me.
What do you propose as alternative policies in this area?
Well, the alternative policy, it seems to me, is to make it quite clear that people don't fuss with the security of the free world with impunity. It seems to me clear that if we descended resonantly and devastatingly on people who do that kind of thing, that people wouldn't do that kind of thing in the future. It seems to me that the dilemma in Cuba is a brilliant example of the perversity with which we accomplish things. In order to persuade the Soviet Union to withdraw missiles that it brought there in the first instance, we promised never to liberate Cuba, so that the status quo ante was not restored. But on the contrary, the Soviet Union, in effect, we forwarded the Monroe Doctrine in such a way as to protect Soviet interests in this hemisphere. Now, if we had made it clear by moving decisively against Castro that this kind of thing isn't going to happen, if we had made it clear by moving decisively against communists in Southeast Asia, using primarily, of course, Asian manpower to do that, then we would have made clear lessons that would last perhaps over a period of decades and generations. We learned this from Lord Castlereagh at the Congress of Vienna, and we learned it previously under the Roman Empire. Nemo me licessit impunere. Nobody moves against me with impunity. And this is the responsible way for essentially not an imperial power, but a power that has imperial responsibilities to act.
But the problem now is that there are two imperial powers, really, and it's a standoff.
I know, no, it's not. It's only a standoff, but I'm not advocating at this point because I think it's unfeasible to do so. Is a war of liberation, and I think that one has to recognize the more or less de facto sovereignty of the Soviet Union over its own territories. There was a time when I think we could have secured the freedom of Poland. I think at this particular moment it is simply unlikely as a historical fact that we can affect the freedom of Poland.
This is NET, the National Educational Television Network.
domestic, social, and economic problems. But I do believe that politically and psychologically,
National
as long as the
Educational
country is
Television
oriented
presents
toward that
The
ghastly
Dissenters,
war,
conversation with the editors
nothing
and
very much
publishers
is
of
likely
political
to be
opinion
done
magazines.
domestically, though we
This
should
week,
continue to
Irving
try.
Howe,
But
professor
assuming
of
that
English at
next,
Hunter College, New York
little
City,
while, there will
and
be
editor of
some kind
Dissent,
solution to
a
the war
democratic
now. Then the
socialist
country ought to
bi-monthly
turn
founded
its
14
major
years ago.
attention, obviously, towards the
Interviewed
problems
by
of
Donald
the city.
Fauser.
Now,
Tell us, let's talk about first your vision as a democratic socialist of what the goals of this country should be in the next decade.
I think in the next decade, the country has 2 or 3 fundamental problems. But the prerequisite for even approaching those problems, let alone solving them, is of course to end the war in Vietnam. I don't agree with those people who think that there is some economic incapacity or some economic limitation which prevents us from both conducting the war in Vietnam and from solving domestic, social, and economic problems. But I do believe that politically and psychologically, as long as the country is oriented toward that ghastly war, then nothing very much is likely to be done domestically, though we should continue to try. But assuming that in the next little while there will be some kind of solution to the war in Vietnam, then the country ought to turn its major attention, obviously, toward the problems of the city. Now, the problems of the city can't be put in one rack. They are very numerous and very complex, but they have to do, most significantly, of course, with the rise of the Negro ghetto on the one hand, and then with other matters which affect both Negroes and whites, like education, transportation, that is, the problem of quality of life. On the first of these, in the question of the Negro ghetto and the Negro Revolution, as it's called, I would say that our view is that what we need in America is some equivalent to the Marshall Plan of the 50s, where the country mobilized an enormous amount of resources in order to rescue the economy and society of Western Europe, and did it pretty successfully. There's no inherent reason why this could not be done in America as well. A close friend and colleague of mine, Bayard Rustin, has been pushing for something known as the Randolph budget. The Randolph budget, named after A. Philip Randolph, the famous Negro labor leader, the Randolph budget is simply a scheme by which a larger portion of American social allocation is devoted to the cities, to the Negro communities. We face a very, very difficult problem here. Great hopes were aroused among the Negroes in the last 10 or 12 years. Some very significant gains were made, but naturally people, when they begin to win some gains, have their expectations raised. Once those expectations are raised, you either have to fulfill them or you're going to have more trouble than before the expectations were raised at all. Now, there is really no inherent reason, for example, why in a country as rich and as large as this, we couldn't proceed with a whole battery of plans, some of the things that are in the Randolph budget, some of the things that Daniel Moynihan proposes. For example, a simple idea that Moynihan suggests, that we now have 2 mail deliveries a day in the United States, something which every civilized country has. They even have it in Cape Cod. And thereby, the government would be required to hire a great many additional people, largely unskilled. And instead of the pathology and demoralization which is accompanied by relief and welfare, this would be a significant step toward rebuilding the social fabric and the economic morale of people in the cities. That's just a simple notion, and obviously there had to be many more complex ones. But that seems to me the essential thing in the coming period.
There was an article by a man named Reagan in Dissent magazine not too long ago, which dealt with just this problem, and he suggested that there should be a priority given to integration when it conflicts with other social goals of the country now. Do you feel that way?
That's a complex and it's a tricky problem, and it's one on which I think it's desperately necessary that we try to be clear. My own view is that, by and large, integration and economic social progress go hand in hand. I think that at the very point where the impulse toward integration was stopped, say 2 or 3 years ago, at that point also the impulse toward significant economic reforms in the cities was also stopped. There are people who say, let's just improve the Negro ghettos. Let them have everything they want. Well, let them have 5% of what they want is what they really mean, as long as they stay put and keep out of our suburbs. I don't think that's going to work psychologically or politically. I don't think it's going to work economically. My own very strong view of it is that really to root out the economic deprivation and the social pathology of the ghettos, this requires the extension of integrated housing, the improvement of job opportunities for Negroes, the availability of special kinds of training, the opening of union apprenticeship programs, a whole range of things of that sort. And these are relatively modest goals. They are what I'd call the first level of goals, and there is no reason whatever, economically or socially, why they can't be achieved. It's only a question of whether we have the moral clarity and political will. At this moment right now, I don't think the country does, but I think we'd better wake up to the need for it.
Now, all of that costs money. Do you propose that this be done by government through increased government subsidies of public housing, through a government business cooperation? How do you propose this?
By and large, I think it's the responsibility of the federal government. So far as I can see, the cities themselves cannot solve these problems. They can't solve them because they don't have the resources, and they can't solve them because more and more of the affluent white middle class is moving away into the suburbs, and the cities are in a bankrupt state. The states, by and large, also tend to be under the control of rural legislatures, extremely backward and timid and conservative. The problems also are of such an enormous extent and so deeply rooted socially that they can be attacked, I think, only on a national basis. Now, by now we've gotten over the budget mythology. We recognize that deficit spending and that an unbalanced budget can actually be a way toward economic growth. I'd say this, that if the vast sums of money which are being poured into a war in Vietnam, which we cannot win and which is, I think, morally an unjustified war, if even half of that money were used for the improvement of the American cities, for our own people, then tremendous steps could be made, even without raising the tax base. The significant disputes in the country in the next 10 years will be what I'd call between the right Keynesians and the left Keynesians. Everyone's going to agree upon the need for social allocation. Everyone's going to agree upon the need for government spending. Only a few 19th century antiquarians like Reagan pretends to be against it, though I guess he probably really isn't. But the real problem will be, I think, toward what end will the spending be put? Will it be put, for example, toward building up a large so-called screen against Chinese missile penetration, which it is announced in advance as ineffective, or will it be put toward the social reconstruction of the country? In a sense, the United States right now is like a highly advanced industrial plant which has begun to run down because we were ahead 2 or 3 decades ago, and now various countries have leapfrogged over us. But the resources are there if we want to engage in this kind of thing.
And I'm interested also in what has been referred to by Mr. Reagan again in that in his article about the proletarian status of migrant farm workers and that sort of thing. Is there, or do you believe there should be more legislation?
Oh, absolutely. That I think can be covered simply by a rise on the minimum wage and a more rigorous application of the minimum wage laws. I would say right now, for example, that if the minimum wage were raised to $1.80 or $90 or $2 an hour, this would do more good for the poor, which means to a large extent in the cities, the Negro poor, than all kinds of programs of local autonomy and all sorts of social work schemes and all kinds of anti-poverty boards. Much of the trouble with the poverty programs and with certain kinds of young people who are getting involved in organizing the poor is that they tend to assume the permanent existence of the poor. My idea about the poor is that the best thing to do with them is to abolish them as the poor, and that they should be allowed thereby and encouraged and helped to enter the society at large.
We're talking about here about a redistribution of income, then.
Yes, that's a very essential point, a redistribution of income.
Speak to that subject.
A redistribution of income is something which can be, to a large extent, achieved first through social subsidies and social allocations by the federal government, and second through a progressive tax policy. I believe that tax policy at the present time has become more and more retrogressive in that it doesn't change with changing circumstances.
And you believe circumstances have changed in the United States?
Oh, of course they change very sharply, yes. There's obviously a great need. That is, the whole social struggle that goes on in this country within the limits of the welfare state, it's a social struggle in which the contending forces don't take at issue, don't put at issue the survival of the society itself, but they are struggling for power within the society, for the allocation of resources, for the allocation of funds and wealth. This social struggle takes the form of two things, at least. First, how will the government money be spent? Secondly, upon whom will the tax burden be placed? And this is a sort of modernized version of a traditional class struggle idea. That is to say, who will get help and who will pay for the help. Our view tends to be, by and large, that that there is an enormous need for what Kenneth Galbraith had called a revival or a reconstruction of the welfare state. As far as Galbraith goes, we are very much with him. We don't believe he finally does go far enough, but as far as he goes, we're very much with him for the reconstruction of the welfare state by everything from fixing up parks to hospitals. The whole plant has been allowed to get shabby and run down and neglected.
How do you propose to sell this? And this obviously means more taxes for this big squashy middle class. How can you sell that to this middle class in this country?
Well, it means, for one thing, more taxes on the corporations. As far as it means more taxes for the middle class, I think what is needed is a sustained educational campaign along these lines. First, that bringing in millions of people who are now a burden on the society through welfare, pathology, and the rest, bringing them into the society and making them more productive or enabling them to become more productive, this is really a way of enriching the society. The gross national product would grow as a consequence of that. That's one thing. Secondly, that's the positive argument. The negative argument is what the devil is going to happen if this isn't done, because these people are no longer going to take it at the bottom of the heap.
As we've seen in the cities.
As we've seen, right.
Now, you mentioned again the corporations. One way to raise the money is to raise it through corporations. Corporations, it seems to me, in the United States are becoming increasingly involved in all aspects of our lives. They're even moving now into education, as well as the proposal to have them move into housing.
Yes, that's true. They are moving into various aspects of the society, but there is no social control over them. That is, there's a certain amount of what I would consider moral gilding of what is the corporation's main purpose still, namely the accumulation and magnification of profit. But there is no, this is one of the main long-range problems, not an immediate one, but one of the main long-range problems. That is to say, what control will the man who works for General Motors have over the policy of the corporation? We believe that he should have control, that it shouldn't be simply in the hands of a small number of stockholders and shareholders and managers. What control will the teacher have?
How much control? As much control as management and the people who own the stock?
That depends at which stage of the game you're at. Obviously, in the immediate future, the long-range socialist program in America is not, though I think it's very important educationally, very important to press it, is not an immediate option. And so our view, for example, that the major industries ought to be socially owned, which is to say not merely or necessarily by the government, but by complexes and cooperatives of the people involved in the industries themselves, that isn't an immediate option. But it certainly is an immediate option, for example, that the automobile workers should be in a position to determine various things about government policy. We're not terribly respectful toward what is known as ownership prerogatives. The notion of ownership prerogatives changes with time. There was a time when ownership prerogative meant no recognition of trade unions. They got over that, and I think with sufficient social pressure, they'll get over other notions of the same sort.
Now, you also started to mention teachers.
Yeah. Well, I think teachers, and I was an ardent supporter of the recent teachers' strike in New York City. I think teachers should have some important say in the determination of educational policy, not merely the people who are sitting in the offices, not merely the Board of Education, etc. This is a complex matter because there are conflicting interests, different constituencies, teachers, parents, even the children should have some say, supervisors, and then the community as a whole. There are dangerous aspects in this. The notion, for example, of local community control of the schools in certain parts of the city is, I think, an idea which certain people on the left and certain liberals are supporting but haven't thought out completely. Is it really true, for example, that if there's a Negro principal in a school in Harlem that there'll be better education? I'm not at all sure that's true. Are some of the people who are claiming to represent the community, are they really representative of the community or just a small activist fringe? And if you allow local school determination in a place where you want it, how will you oppose it in a neighborhood where you know the consequence would be that segregationists and reactionaries and scissor bills and rednecks would then control the schools?
What you're talking about here, both in terms of the corporations and in terms of teaching, just as an indication of what you would have happen in society, is a great diffusion, it seems to me, of decision-making.
A diffusion of decision-making and what I would call the penetration of democracy into economic life. That is, taking democracy out of merely the formal political area, which I'm very much for and ardently support, and extending it to the whole of political, to the whole of socio-economic life. This is not going to happen overnight, but I think there are signs that it is slowly on the way.
A lot of people would say hurrah to that, but a lot of people would also say that what you're doing is suggesting that we undermine the so-called profit system.
That's exactly right. That's exactly what we want to do.
And they feel that this would rob people of the motivation to work, to succeed, to strive, to imagine and build.
I don't think that's true at all. For one thing, the overwhelming majority of Americans don't work under a profit motive. Most of us work for a salary, often an inadequate salary. And for example, in my profession, in college teaching, my impression is that those who are creative and those who really have something to offer, only rarely is the economic incentive the major one there. Secondly, there is no reason why economic incentive or socioeconomic incentive couldn't be present and shouldn't be present under a society in which the profit motive would no longer be the dominant one. This, of course, is a fairly esoteric matter at the moment in America because it foresees a gradual socialization, a gradual trend toward democratic socialism. Whether that is really going to happen, I don't know. There are plenty of powerful counter checks and there are plenty of dangers along the way.
Tell me, Mr. Howe, as editor of Dissent magazine and a not-so-old democratic socialist, what you of the old left or the not-so-old left?
Let's say the middle-aged left.
The middle-aged
left.
Middle-aged left. What do you feel about the new left in this country?
There really isn't any one thing called the new left, and so I'll try to be synoptic and summarize what I think are some of the main tendencies. When it first began, I was extremely favorable and enthusiastic. For example, when the kids started piling into Mississippi and the whole program of helping out there, I thought that was great. Some of the protests about the diffusion of power and freedom on the campus, I'm for. Some of them are mindless, but some of them are good. The protest against the Vietnam War, by and large, I agree with that, though I don't agree with some of the forms of it, but I agree with the motivation and principle. But there are elements of the new left outlook which seem to me very, very dubious. For example, the notion they have that liberalism is the main enemy in the United States. I think that's sheer nonsense, thoughtlessness. The liberals are often inadequate. They often fail to fulfill liberal goals and value. They sometimes betray the aims and goals of liberalism. When that happens, then I think the obligation of people like myself is to press them and to say, do what you claim you want to do. But I don't believe that in a country where Barry Goldwater got, how many, 24 million votes, and where the far right is still a very powerful force, and where there is no really organized left to speak of, I think it's insanity to say that liberalism is the main enemy. A second point concerns their attitude towards communism. As a democratic socialist, I believe that any kind of progress, political, economic, cultural, has for its indispensable premise the existence of democratic rights, democratic society. We've learned from the last 50 years in the experience of the communist countries how empty all their talk of equality and freedom is when you can't say the premier or the boss of the country is what. I couldn't even mention some of the things that people do freely say about Lyndon Johnson in this country. When you can't organize an opposition party, when you can't put out a paper saying the government stinks, then it's no good, no matter what it's called. And we believe that democracy is the indispensable premise for individual life, for oppositional activity, etc. It's not that there is much pro-communist feeling in the New Left. There isn't very much of that, really. There is a little Maoist fringe, you know, which thinks China's great, but that's pretty far out. It's that there is some sense that it isn't fashionable, that it isn't proper to speak out freely against communism. I am against capitalism and I'm against communism for fairly much the same reasons. There are other things I could say along the same lines in regard to the New Left, but these would be some of the main grounds of opposition. One other thing I should add is that their notion that they don't want to get involved in American politics, they're afraid of being co-opted. You know, most of them are middle-class boys and girls who have had it pretty well in the last 15, 20 years, who don't remember the Depression, who don't have any clear idea of what a tremendous contribution trade unions made to this country. They never had to work under a Ford Motor Company a foreman before the union came in. They never knew that there were garment workers in New York City working for $12 a week before the union came in. They looked down their nose at the unions. That's because they lack a sense of history and a sense of what the unions still do in this country, even if it isn't enough. But they're afraid of being co-opted. That is to say, they're concerned with their own purity. As a consequence, though they have a clear idea that power corrupts, what they don't understand is, I think, that sometimes powerlessness also corrupts or can corrupt. Now, there are people in office who don't attract me in any way, but if I were living, say, in South Dakota, I'd vote for George McGovern, and I'd work for him because of the stand he's taken on the war. And I'd do the same thing in other places for other people. That is to say, I think that a radical in America today cannot stand off and say that he is above the battle or that everything that's going on is a mere masquerade, that it's only Tweedledee and Tweedledum, because it isn't only Tweedledee and Tweedledum. There's a tremendous difference between the dove and the hawk. I want to go into the electoral process, support the dove against the hawk.
About the violence that we find so much in the New Left today.
A lot of that violence is just verbal. It's irresponsible talk. Very few of them really are revolutionists. And that's, I think, from my point of view, a hopeful sign. I think they'll get over some of that talk. But just because it is talk, I mean, the SDS said at one point they were going to organize guerrillas in the cities, but they won't. They're much too nice, so to speak, and they're much too middle class, and they don't have the power to organize guerrillas. The violence that is really serious, of course, is the rioting of the past summer. Where I sharply disagree with and where I sharply condemn the New Left is the indiscriminate approval of this violence, which was expressed at the Chicago conference, that big fiasco they had recently, in which riots are identified with revolutions, rebellions, and uprising. My own strong conviction is that those riots, one may understand the social origins of them and sympathize, therefore, but the effects are almost certain to militate against the Negro community. It's their own people that get killed. It's the Negro stores that get burned down. It sets up a severe counter-sentiment backlash among the whites. It leads to a false polarization. Now, the New Left thinks it wants that polarization. That's because it has no historical sense of what that polarization would mean. It would probably mean fascism in America. I don't want fascism in America. I believe it's necessary to try to organize large portions of the population in the direction of progress. That means not to confine oneself to a few half-baked ideologues, but to try to involve large numbers of people, liberals, labor unions, churches, etc., in the effort to extend the limits of the welfare state, to improve the conditions that exist, and then that makes possible a step further beyond.
They seem to create their heroes in not the large, not out of the large countries, not out of the Soviet Union, which they think has become organizationally corrupt. Not out of China, where they feel there's one godlike leader and a bunch of slaves, but out of people like Castro, not out of Titoism even.
Yeah, no, Titoism, they feel that's closer to social democrats like me, as in some sense maybe it is. No, their image of the revolutionary leader tends to be the romantic figure, or what they think is a romantic figure, with the beard, with the guerrillas. That is, they've lost faith in the Marxist idea of the working class. They don't have much belief in democratic majorities. They really have a version of the anarchist or putschist idea, a small insurrection led by heroic guerrillas. Now, there may be a few countries in the world, in Latin America, where that makes sense, though it doesn't mean that one likes it, but where it at least has some relevance. But if you look through the heroes of the Third World with whom the New Left identified, a miserable character like Sukarno, a wretched one like Nasser, a half-forgotten one like Ben Bella, and Nkrumah, you know, the eternal redeemer, this doesn't seem to me really very much substance in the way of social and political idealism. I think they are thoroughly deluded in that score.
Do you find any great cleavage between the white New Left and the black New Left?
Well, I feel that what is going on among certain young Negroes now, though I don't agree with it, is something that I can at least understand with that. Is the desperation there seems to me authentic. I think Rap Brown does himself and his own people a terrible disservice when he talks about burn, baby, burn. But I can understand why some kid in the streets of Harlem responds to that. There are good emotional and historical reasons for that response. As I say, I don't approve of it, but I understand it. But when some kid out of Harvard University, you know, indulges in this, if there's going to be any burning, he's not going to pay for it. He's going to be off somewhere else. In other words, what you have here is a kind of vicarious and thereby irresponsible adventurism.
Corporations, it seems to me, in the United States are becoming increasingly involved in all aspects of our lives. They're even moving now into education, as well as the proposal to have them move into housing.
Yes, that's true. They are moving into various aspects of the society, but there is no social control over them. That is, there's a certain amount of what I would consider
This is NET, the National Educational Television Network.